The first thing I remember wasn't the flames. It was how quiet everything got right before them. The night my house burned down, the air had this strange stillness to it, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, like even the crickets knew something was about to go wrong. And I was standing barefoot on cold hardwood floors at 2:13 a.m., staring at the faint orange glow bleeding through my kitchen window before the smoke alarm even had time to catch up with reality. And there was this smell, not sharp, not explosive, just slow and suffocating, like something deliberate, like something planned. And I remember grabbing my phone, my keys, nothing else, because instinct doesn't care about property or memories. It just cares about getting out. And by the time I stepped onto my front lawn, the glow had already climbed higher, licking the edges of the roofline, turning the place I'd spent 15 years restoring into something unrecognizable, something distant. And the sound that followed wasn't a bang or a crash. It was this low, steady crackling, like drywood giving up, piece by piece, like time unraveling in real time. And then I saw her across the street, standing perfectly still under a street lamp, arms folded, posture straight. Margaret Whitmore, HOA President, dressed like she was waiting for a rideshare instead of watching a house burn, her face lit just enough to show that calm, practiced smile she wore at every community meeting, the kind that made everything she said sound polite, even when it wasn't. And she didn't look surprised, didn't look concerned, didn't even reach for her phone. She just watched, like she'd already seen this ending play out in her head. And something about that, something about how composed she was, cut deeper than the fire ever could. Because fires are chaotic, unpredictable, but people aren't. Not when they've decided exactly what they want. And I stood there, the grass damp under my feet, the heat pressing against my skin from across the yard. And I realized I wasn't just watching my home disappear, I was watching a line get crossed, one that couldn't be walked back, not with apologies, not with fines, not with another one of her carefully worded letters slipped under my door. And the sirens came eventually, distant at first, then louder, slicing through the quiet like they were late to a story that had already been decided. Neighbors started to gather at the edges of their driveways, whispering, pointing, but keeping their distance like proximity might make them part of it. And Margaret finally moved, just a step, just enough to shift her weight. And for a second our eyes met across the street, and I could see it there, buried under the surface, not fear, not regret, just certainty, like she believed this was over, like she believed she had already won, and maybe to anyone else, it would have looked that way. A house gone, a man standing in the yard with nothing left but smoke and questions. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I recognized patterns for a living, I understood systems, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to dismantle them when someone thought they were untouchable. And as the first fire truck pulled up and the red lights washed over her face, turning that calm smile into something almost artificial, I realized this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for, because a week from that night, Margaret Whitmore would walk into a courtroom expecting to tell her version of this story, and she had no idea whose courtroom it actually was. And the moment she turned away from the flames, I knew she had already made her biggest mistake. I did not go back to the house the next morning because there was no house left to return to, just a blackened outline and a smell that clung to everything like it had weight, like it wanted to stay. And instead I stood across the street with a paper cup of gas station coffee that had already gone cold, watching the cleanup crews move with that quiet efficiency people only use when something irreversible has already happened. And it struck me how quickly a place can stop being yours, not legally, not officially, but emotionally. Like the moment the structure was gone, the memories lost their anchor, and all that remained was evidence waiting to be interpreted by someone else. And I have spent most of my adult life understanding how evidence becomes narrative, how small details turn into conclusions inside rooms where people decide what is true and what is not. But out there on that curb, none of that felt abstract. It felt personal, and I kept seeing her in my mind, the way Margaret had stood under that streetlight without urgency, without surprise, and that image did not fit the version of events anyone would expect, because normal people react, they call, they move, they do something, and she had done nothing, which told me more than any report ever could. And I have learned that when something does not fit, you do not ignore it, you follow it. You pull on that thread until the pattern reveals itself, even if it takes time. especially if it takes time. And time is something I understand better than most, because my work has always demanded patience, discipline, and the ability to sit in silence while other people talk themselves into corners. And that is not something you pick up overnight. It is something built over years, long hours inside rooms where every word matters and every pause is weight. And people tend to assume that power looks loud, that it announces itself, but real authority is quiet. It observes. It waits. It lets others underestimate it. And that has always worked in my favor, especially in places like Willowbrook Estates, where everything runs on appearances, where people like Margaret build influence by being seen, by controlling the narrative in small, everyday ways. And when I first moved here, I understood exactly what kind of environment it was: manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, rules written in language that sounded reasonable until you read them twice. And I chose not to disrupt any of it. I kept my head down, paid my dues, attended exactly 2 meetings in 5 years, spoke only when necessary, because blending in is often more effective than standing out, and no one ever asked what I did for a living, not directly, and I never offered, because titles change how people behave. They make them cautious, and caution limits what they reveal, and I prefer honesty, even when it is unintentional, especially when it is unintentional, and Margaret had never been cautious around me. Not once. She treated me like any other homeowner who could be managed, corrected, or pressured into compliance. And that told me everything about how she saw the world. A hierarchy where she stood at the top of something she believed was real, something she believed she controlled, and I let her believe that, because correcting her would have changed the dynamic too early. It would have forced her to adjust, to hide things better. And people only make mistakes when they feel secure, when they think they have already won. And standing there that morning, watching the last of the smoke fade into the sky, I realized that whatever happened that night was not random. It was the result of a pattern that had been building long before the fire, a series of small decisions that led to one large consequence. And those patterns leave traces. In paperwork, in conversations, in the way people move when they think no one is paying attention. And I have spent years learning how to read those traces, how to connect them in ways that hold up under scrutiny. And that is what matters, not suspicion, not instinct, but proof that can stand in a room where the truth is tested. And as I turned away from the remains of what used to be my home, I could already feel that familiar shift in my thinking, that transition from reaction to analysis, from loss to process. Because grief does not stop you from doing what you are trained to do. It just changes why you do it. And somewhere behind me, I could hear Margaret's voice drifting across the street, calm and measured as she spoke to someone I could not see. And I did not need to turn around to know she believed this was just another problem she had already handled. Margaret Whitmore did not become the most feared person in Willowbrook by accident. And the more I thought about her that morning, the more I realized the fire was not the beginning of anything. It was just the most visible outcome of a system she had been building for years, a system that thrived on small pressures, quiet intimidation, and the kind of authority that only exists because no one ever stops to question it. And if you asked anyone in the neighborhood, they would describe her the same way: polite, organized, dedicated to maintaining standards, the kind of woman who brings color-coded folders to meetings and remembers everyone's first name. But those descriptions never quite matched the details I had observed over time. The subtle shifts in tone when she spoke to certain people, the way her smile would tighten when someone challenged her, the almost imperceptible pause before she decided whether a situation needed to be escalated. And I have learned that real control is rarely loud. It is measured, calculated, and always justified on paper, and Margaret understood that better than anyone. She never acted without a document, never made a move that could not be explained as part of the rules, even when those rules seemed to bend in her favor more often than not. And over the past 5 years, I had watched her turn minor infractions into leverage. A mailbox painted the wrong shade, a fence an inch too high, a work truck parked overnight, each issue small on its own but powerful when repeated, when documented, when backed by the language of compliance and community standards. And people responded the way people always do when faced with that kind of pressure. They adjusted, they apologized, they paid the fines, because fighting it required time, knowledge, and a willingness to stand alone. And most people simply wanted peace, which made Margaret stronger with every quiet concession. And then there were the relationships, the ones that never appeared in official records but influenced everything behind the scenes. Her husband sitting on the city council, her connections with local inspectors, the way certain complaints were resolved faster when they aligned with her interests, and none of it was illegal on the surface. That was the brilliance of it. Everything existed in that gray space where intent is difficult to prove, and patterns are easy to dismiss unless you know how to look for them. And I had noticed those patterns long before my house was reduced to ash, small inconsistencies that did not belong, decisions that seemed too convenient, outcomes that benefited the same person over and over again. And I chose not to act on them at the time, not because I missed them, but because acting too early would have closed doors I needed open. And Margaret had never considered me a threat. Not really. To her, I was just another homeowner who kept to himself, paid his dues, and occasionally declined to participate in her version of community engagement. And that miscalculation gave me something valuable: space to observe without interference, space to understand how her system operated without triggering any defensive adjustments. And the more I understood, the clearer it became that her power depended on one simple assumption: that no one around her had the time or the ability to challenge her in a meaningful way. And assumptions like that are fragile. They hold until the moment they do not. And standing there with the last of the smoke fading into the morning air, I could see how each of her previous decisions had led to this point, how confidence had turned into certainty, and certainty had removed whatever caution she might have once had. Because people do not escalate to something this extreme unless they believe there will be no consequences, unless they believe the system they built will protect them no matter what happens. And Margaret believed that completely. I could hear it in the way she spoke, calm, controlled, already shaping the narrative for anyone who would listen, framing the situation as unfortunate, unpredictable, something that could not have been prevented. And for most people, that would have been enough. They would accept the explanation, move on, and let the process take its course. But I have never been most people, and as I walked back to my car, the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes, I realized that for the first time since I moved into Willowbrook, Margaret Whitmore had made a decision without understanding who she was really dealing with. The first official report arrived just after noon, printed on thick paper that still carried the faint smell of fresh ink, and it read exactly the way I expected it would: careful language, neutral tone, no definitive cause listed, just phrases like "under investigation," and no immediate evidence of external involvement, the kind of wording designed to close questions before they fully form. And I stood there in the temporary rental kitchen, the hum of an unfamiliar refrigerator filling the silence, running my fingers along the edge of the page, feeling the weight of what was missing more than what was written, because reports like this are never about what they say. They are about what they choose not to say. And Margaret's voice echoed in my head from earlier that morning, calm and reassuring, as she spoke to a small group of neighbors gathered near the sidewalk, already positioning the event as unfortunate, isolated, something that did not reflect the community. And I could see how easily that version would settle into place, how quickly people would accept it and move on, because it was easier than asking questions that might not have comfortable answers. And that is how systems like hers survive, not through force, but through convenience, through the quiet agreement that it is better not to look too closely. And for a moment, I considered what it would mean to follow that same path, to let the insurance process unfold, to rebuild somewhere else, to treat the fire as an end instead of a beginning. And the thought lasted exactly as long as it took for me to remember the way she had stood there, unmoved, unbothered, like she had already accounted for every possible outcome. And that was the part that did not fit, the part that refused to settle into the neat narrative being offered. And I have learned that when something does not fit, you do not force it. You examine it from every angle until it reveals why. And so I started with the simplest place, the timeline, not the official one, but the real one, the sequence of events as they actually happened. The moment I noticed the glow, the delay before the alarm sounded, the way the fire seemed to take hold in multiple areas at once, not explosively, not dramatically, just evenly, like it had been given time to establish itself before being discovered. And none of those details proved anything on their own, but together they created a pattern that deserved a closer look. And patterns always leave traces, not just physical ones, but administrative ones, records, communications, approvals, things that exist because systems require documentation to function. And Margaret's system was no different. It relied on paperwork, on permissions, on the appearance of order, which meant there would be a trail somewhere, not necessarily obvious, not necessarily direct, but present, because even the most careful people cannot operate without leaving something behind. And I set the report down on the counter and opened my laptop, not with urgency, not with anger, but with the same steady focus I bring to every case that crosses my desk, because this was not about reacting. It was about understanding, and understanding requires patience. It requires the willingness to sit with incomplete information and let it expand over time. And as I began pulling up public records, zoning maps, permit histories, I could already feel the shape of something forming beneath the surface. Something that connected more than just one night. Something that suggested this was not an isolated event at all. And outside the window, a car slowed as it passed, tires crunching softly against the gravel, and I did not need to look up to know exactly who was inside, because Margaret had always preferred to keep an eye on things personally, especially when she believed she had already secured the outcome. I made the mistake of treating it like a normal case at first, like something that could be approached directly, logically, with a simple request for clarification, and that mistake cost me exactly 48 hours of silence and one very carefully worded letter that arrived in my temporary mailbox with Margaret Whitmore's name printed neatly in the upper left corner, the paper heavier than necessary, the tone polite enough to pass as concern, and the message underneath it all unmistakably clear. She was not interested in questions, only in closure, and I stood there reading it twice, then a third time, the faint scent of her perfume somehow still clinging to the envelope. And it struck me how practiced this was, how familiar she was with shaping perception before facts could catch up, because the letter did not deny anything, not directly. It simply reinforced the narrative she had already started building. Unfortunate incident, full cooperation with authorities, commitment to community stability. Each phrase carefully chosen to sound responsible while revealing nothing. And I realized then that approaching her head-on had given her exactly what she needed: time to adjust, time to reinforce her position, time to make sure that whatever had happened would remain buried under layers of procedure and politeness. And I have seen this before, not in neighborhoods, not in HOA disputes, but in cases where individuals believed their control over a system made them immune to scrutiny. And the first thing they always do when challenged is close ranks. They document, they prepare, they create a version of events that can survive surface-level inspection. And for a moment, I let myself sit with that realization, the quiet hum of the rental unit pressing in around me, the unfamiliar walls, the absence of everything that used to be mine, and I could feel the frustration there, not loud, not overwhelming, just steady, like a pressure building behind something that had not yet been released, because this was the part people do not talk about. The moment when you try to resolve something the normal way and it fails, when the system you are supposed to rely on gives you nothing back but vague language and delayed responses. And most people stop there. They accept the limits, they move on. But I have never been wired that way. And as I set the letter down on the table, I understood that whatever I was dealing with was not going to reveal itself through direct confrontation. Not anymore. Margaret had already adapted to that. She was expecting it, which meant I needed to stop thinking like someone affected by the situation and start thinking like someone outside of it, someone analyzing it from a distance. And distance changes everything. It removes emotion from the equation. It allows patterns to surface that would otherwise stay hidden under frustration and urgency. And so I stepped back, not physically, but mentally. I stopped trying to prove anything and started trying to understand everything. The permits, the inspections, the previous complaints filed within the neighborhood, the frequency of enforcement actions, the properties that seemed to receive more attention than others, and slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to form, not clear yet, not complete, but enough to suggest that what happened to me was not isolated. It was part of something larger, something that extended beyond a single incident, and that realization changed the entire direction of what came next. Because if this was not just about my house, then it was not just about me. And that meant the answer was not going to be found in a single report or a single conversation. It was going to be buried in the structure Margaret had spent years building. And structures like that do not collapse from the outside. They unravel from within. And as I opened another set of records, cross-referencing dates and approvals, I noticed something small, almost insignificant on its own, but out of place enough to matter. A permit issued just days before the fire, tied to a property that had no record of requesting it. And for the first time since that night, something felt less like coincidence and more like intention. The permit did not belong to my property, and that was the first detail that made me pause, not because it was unusual for paperwork to be misfiled, but because everything Margaret Whitmore touched was rarely careless, and this felt careless in a way that did not match her pattern. And I leaned back in the chair, the soft hum of the laptop fan filling the room as I pulled up the full record, scrolling slowly, deliberately, letting each line settle before moving to the next, because details like this do not reveal themselves when rushed. They require patience, and the more I read, the clearer it became that this was not a simple clerical error. The permit had been issued under a general maintenance classification, something broad enough to avoid attention, something that would not trigger additional inspections or require detailed reporting, and yet it was tied to a contractor that did not normally operate in Willowbrook, a name that appeared nowhere else in the neighborhood's recent records. And that alone would not mean anything to most people, but to me, it stood out immediately. Because systems rely on consistency, and anything that breaks that consistency deserves a closer look. And I began cross-referencing the contractor's license number, tracing it through public databases, following the trail the way I have done countless times before, not with urgency, but with precision, because when you are looking for something hidden, you do not chase it, you let it come into focus on its own. And what I found was not dramatic, not at first, just a series of small inconsistencies, an address that did not quite match, a registration that had been updated unusually recently, a gap in activity that suggested the company had been dormant until very recently, and I could feel that familiar shift again, that quiet recognition that I was no longer looking at coincidence, but at something constructed, something intentional and outside. The afternoon light stretched across the parking lot, casting long shadows that moved slowly as time passed, and I had not realized how long I had been sitting there until the screen dimmed slightly, prompting me to touch the trackpad and bring it back to life. And that small interruption was enough to remind me that this was only one piece of a much larger picture. Because permits do not exist in isolation, they connect to inspections, to approvals, to communications between departments, and each of those connections leaves its own trace, and I started pulling those threads one by one, building a timeline that extended beyond my property, beyond the night of the fire, into the weeks leading up to it. And that was when the pattern began to sharpen. Multiple properties flagged for minor violations, enforcement notices issued in clusters, all within a narrow window of time, all tied back to the same administrative office Margaret frequently coordinated with. And none of it was illegal, not on its face, but it created pressure, it created movement, it shifted attention away from certain areas while focusing it on others. And I could see how easily something could happen in that environment without drawing immediate scrutiny, how a sequence of small distractions could create the space needed for something larger to occur unnoticed. And I sat there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, letting that realization settle. Because this was no longer about a single document or a single decision. This was about a structure that had been carefully arranged to control not just outcomes, but attention itself. And Margaret had been operating within that structure for years, refining it, strengthening it, until it became second nature, until she could move through it without hesitation, without fear of consequence, because she believed she understood every part of it, every weakness, every blind spot. And for a long time, she probably did. But systems change the moment someone else starts to see them clearly. And as I opened another record, this one tied to an inspection request that had been quietly closed without follow-up, I realized that for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was starting to see how it had been allowed to happen in the first place, and that difference changed everything. The inspection request should not have been closed without follow-up, and that was the moment the entire pattern shifted from suspicious to deliberate. Because in every structured system there are safeguards, checkpoints designed to prevent exactly that kind of quiet disappearance. And when those safeguards fail, it is rarely accidental. It is usually because someone made sure they would, and I stared at the record for a long time. Not because I needed to understand what it said, but because I needed to understand why it existed at all. And the more I traced it back, the more connections began to surface, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. The same administrative office appearing again and again, the same approval chains, the same names cycling through different roles as if they were interchangeable pieces in a larger mechanism. And Margaret's name was never directly attached to any of it, not officially, but her influence was there in the structure itself, in the way decisions aligned with her interests, in the timing of enforcement. Actions that seemed to clear the path for something else to occur unnoticed, and I could feel the scope of it expanding beyond what I had initially assumed, because this was not just about one event or one property. This was about a method, a way of operating that relied on distraction, on misdirection, on creating enough administrative noise to bury anything that might stand out. And for most people, that noise is overwhelming. It discourages deeper examination. It convinces them that whatever happened must have a reasonable explanation somewhere within the paperwork. But I have spent years navigating environments exactly like this, places where truth is not hidden by absence, but by excess, by an overload of information designed to obscure rather than clarify. And as I continued pulling records, cross-referencing dates and signatures, a second thread began to emerge, one that tied directly back to the night of the fire, not through direct evidence, but through timing, through a sequence of approvals and closures that created a window, a narrow span of hours where oversight was effectively reduced to nothing. And that window did not exist by chance. It had been constructed, piece by piece, through decisions that appeared unrelated on the surface, but aligned perfectly when viewed together. And that realization carried a different kind of weight, not emotional, not reactive, but structural, because it meant that whatever had happened was supported by a framework designed to protect it, and frameworks like that do not collapse easily. They require precise pressure applied in the right places, and I leaned back again, letting the silence settle around me. The faint ticking of the wall clock marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. And I thought about Margaret, about the confidence she carried, the certainty in her posture that night, and it made sense now in a way it had not before. Because she was not relying on chance, she was relying on a system she believed she controlled completely, a system that had worked for her every time she needed it to. And people like that do not anticipate disruption. They do not prepare for it, because from their perspective, there is nothing to disrupt. Everything is already accounted for, already managed, and that is where they make their mistake, not in the actions themselves, but in the assumption that no one else can see the structure the way they do. And as I opened another file, this one containing communication logs that had been archived but not deleted, I could already sense that I was getting closer to something more concrete, something that would move this beyond pattern recognition into something that could not be explained away as coincidence or administrative error. And that is the threshold that matters, the point where understanding becomes evidence, where observation becomes something that can stand on its own. And I knew I was approaching it, not because of any single detail, but because of how everything was beginning to align, how the gaps between the records were starting to close. And just as I began scrolling through the first set of messages, one entry near the bottom caught my attention, not because of what it said, but because of who had sent it, and the timestamp attached to it was closer to the night of the fire than anything else I had seen so far. The name on that message was not Margaret Whitmore, and that was exactly why it mattered, because the system she operated in was built to keep her insulated, to ensure that anything directly tied to her remained clean, documented, defensible. But this message sat just outside that boundary, sent from a mid-level administrative account that had appeared repeatedly in the permit and inspection records I had been tracing. And the timestamp placed it within hours of the fire, not days, not weeks, but close enough to suggest awareness. And I opened it slowly, not expecting anything explicit, because systems like this do not communicate in obvious terms. They rely on implication, on language that can be interpreted multiple ways depending on who is reading it. And the content itself was brief, almost routine at first glance, a reference to a cleared window, confirmation that certain inspections had been resolved ahead of schedule, and a note about ensuring that no additional site visits were required until further notice. And none of that would raise alarms on its own, but context changes everything. And placed within the timeline I had been building, it aligned too precisely to ignore. It described conditions that would reduce oversight exactly when my property became vulnerable, and I could feel that shift again. That moment when something abstract begins to take on shape, not fully defined yet, but solid enough to hold. And I leaned closer to the screen, rereading the message, paying attention not just to the words, but to the structure, the phrasing, the way it avoided specificity while still conveying intent. And I have seen language like this before, in cases where coordination exists without direct instruction, where individuals operate within an understood framework that does not require explicit orders. And that is what this felt like. Not a directive, but a confirmation, a signal that conditions had been set, that whatever needed to happen could proceed without interference. And the realization settled in slowly, not as shock, but as clarity, because it fit the pattern, it fit the timing, it fit the way Margaret had carried herself that night, certain, composed, like she knew the system would hold. And I scrolled further, looking for additional context, additional messages, anything that might expand on what I was seeing. And there were more, not many, but enough to establish continuity, short exchanges, acknowledgments, references to properties and schedules that, when isolated, meant very little, but when layered together, created a consistent picture of coordination that extended beyond a single event. And that was the point where this stopped being a question of what happened and became a question of how it had been allowed to happen repeatedly without being challenged. And I sat back, letting the weight of that settle, because evidence like this does not just point to an action. It points to a system that supports it, and systems require multiple participants, multiple points of failure that can be exploited or ignored. And Margaret had positioned herself at the center of that, not by leaving direct traces, but by shaping the environment in which those traces were created. And that is a different level of control, one that is harder to detect, but far more consequential once it is understood. And outside, the light had shifted again, the day moving forward in a way that felt disconnected from everything unfolding inside that room. And I realized that I had reached a point where observation alone was no longer enough, because what I was looking at had crossed from pattern into proof, not complete, not yet, but substantial enough to support the next step. And that next step would change the nature of this entirely. Because once something moves into a formal process, once it enters a system designed to evaluate and act on evidence, it can no longer be contained by the structure that created it. And Margaret had built her position on the assumption that no one would ever reach that point, that no one would see enough, understand enough, or care enough to push beyond the surface. And as I saved the records, organizing them with the same precision I have used my entire career, I understood that for the first time since that night, the balance had shifted in a way she could not see coming. And that difference would matter very soon. Once evidence crosses a certain threshold, it stops being something you collect and starts becoming something you structure. And that shift is where most people lose control of the situation. Because raw information is flexible, it can be interpreted, dismissed, or ignored, but structured evidence is different. It has direction, it has purpose, and more importantly, it has consequences. And I spent the next several hours doing exactly that, not adding anything, not assuming anything, just organizing what already existed into a sequence that could not be easily broken apart. Timeline first, always timeline, because events gain meaning through order, not isolation, and when placed correctly, even small details begin to reinforce each other in ways that are difficult to refute. The permit, the inspection closures, the communication logs, each piece aligning with the next, creating a progression that moved steadily toward the night of the fire. And as I worked, I could feel the narrative forming, not as a story, but as a framework, something that could hold under pressure, something that could withstand scrutiny from people trained to question every assumption. And that is the standard I have always applied, not just to others, but to myself. Because if there is a weakness, it will be found, and it is always better to find it first. And there were moments where I paused, not because I was uncertain, but because I needed to test the structure from different angles, to see how it held when viewed from outside my own perspective. And each time, it remained consistent, not perfect, not complete, but strong enough to support the next step. And that next step required something I had deliberately avoided until now, bringing someone else into the process. Because evidence gains weight when it is seen, evaluated, and confirmed by more than one set of eyes. And I knew exactly who to call, not because of convenience, but because of reliability. Someone who understood how to navigate administrative systems without disrupting them prematurely. someone who could verify what I had found without drawing attention to it. And the conversation was brief, controlled, focused entirely on facts, no speculation, no conclusions, just a request for independent confirmation of specific records and timestamps. And that is how you build something that lasts. You do not rush. You do not reveal more than necessary. You let each piece settle into place before moving forward. And when the call ended, I felt the shift again, subtle but unmistakable. The difference between working alone and initiating a process that extends beyond your immediate control. Because once others are involved, the system begins to move in ways you cannot fully predict. And that is both a risk and a necessity. And I accepted that without hesitation. Because the alternative was to remain within the boundaries Margaret had already established, and that was no longer an option. And as the evening settled in, the room growing dim except for the light from the screen, I reviewed everything one more time, not for new information, but for clarity, for consistency, for the kind of precision that ensures nothing can be dismissed as oversight or coincidence. And that is when I noticed something I had not fully appreciated before, not in the documents themselves, but in the way they interacted, a subtle overlap in timing between two separate approvals that should not have occurred simultaneously. An overlap that created a gap, small, almost invisible, but perfectly positioned within the larger sequence. And gaps like that are never accidental. They exist because someone needed them to. And I could feel that realization settle into place. Firm and undeniable, because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This was not just coordination. It was design, and design implies intent, and intent changes everything once it is established. And as I closed the final document and leaned back, the quiet of the room pressing in again, I understood that the next move would not be about finding more. It would be about presenting what was already there in a way that could not be ignored. And that is where everything would begin to shift in ways Margaret Whitmore had not prepared for. By the next morning, everything was in place, not publicly, not visibly, but structurally. And that is where real pressure begins, not with confrontation, but with positioning. Because once the framework is set, the outcome becomes a matter of process rather than argument. And I moved carefully through each step, not rushing, not signaling intent, just initiating the mechanisms that would carry the evidence forward into the appropriate channels. And that process does not look dramatic from the outside. There are no raised voices, no immediate reactions, just submissions, verifications, quiet confirmations that something has entered the system and will now be evaluated according to its own rules. And I have always trusted that process, not blindly, but because I understand how it functions when the inputs are precise, when the structure is solid, when there is no room for ambiguity to take hold. And as I completed the final submission, I felt that shift again, the transition from preparation to execution, the point where everything begins to move on its own momentum. And I stepped away from the desk, the room still carrying that faint unfamiliarity of temporary space. And for the first time since the fire, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not relief, not satisfaction, just awareness that what came next would no longer depend solely on me. And outside, the neighborhood continued exactly as it always had. Cars moving slowly down the street, sprinklers activating in neat, predictable patterns, the appearance of order intact, and Margaret Whitmore remained at the center of it, moving through her routines with the same confidence, the same measured control, because from her perspective, nothing had changed, the narrative was holding, the community had accepted it, and whatever questions existed had not yet reached a level that required her attention. And that was exactly how I needed it to be, because disruption is most effective when it arrives without warning, when it intersects with a system at the precise moment it is least prepared to respond. And over the next few days, small changes began to surface, not obvious, not immediately connected, but present, a delayed response from the administrative office that usually operated with efficiency, an inquiry that required clarification where none had been needed before, subtle indicators that something had entered the system and was beginning to move through it, and I observed all of it without interference. Because once the process begins, interference creates noise, and noise can be used to deflect, to delay, to complicate, and I had no intention of giving Margaret that opportunity, and instead, I maintained the same distance I had established from the beginning, allowing the structure to do what it was designed to do, and it did, slowly, methodically, each step building on the last, each verification reinforcing the next, until the pattern that had once been hidden beneath layers of administrative complexity began to surface in a form that could not be easily dismissed. And that was when the first formal notice was issued, not to me, not directly, but to the office that had processed the original permits, a request for review, routine on its face, but significant in its implications, because reviews open doors. They create access to records that are not typically examined. They invite scrutiny into places that rely on routine to remain unquestioned. And I could almost trace the path it would take from there, the questions it would generate, the connections it would uncover, and Margaret, for all her control, for all her preparation, had no visibility into that process, not yet, because it was still contained within the system she believed she understood completely. And that is where the real shift begins, not when someone is confronted, but when the foundation beneath them starts to move in ways they cannot see. And as I stood by the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the street, I noticed her again, stepping out of her car, posture unchanged, expression composed, moving with the same certainty she had always carried. And for a moment, nothing about her suggested that anything was different. But systems do not announce when they begin to turn. They reveal it only when it is too late to stop them. The first time Margaret Whitmore realized something was wrong, it was not because anyone confronted her, not because anyone accused her, but because the system she relied on stopped responding the way it always had. And I could see it in the subtle changes that began to ripple through her routine. The slight delay when she checked her phone during a conversation, the brief hesitation before she responded to a neighbor's question, the way her posture shifted just enough to suggest that something no longer felt entirely under control. And those are the moments that matter, not the public reactions, not the statements made in meetings, but the private adjustments people make when they sense that something has changed beneath the surface. And I watched it unfold over the next several days, not directly, not obviously, but through the same distance I had maintained from the beginning, observing without interfering, because once the process reaches this stage, intervention is unnecessary. The system begins to apply its own pressure, and that pressure does not come all at once. It builds gradually, inquiry by inquiry, request by request, until the structure that once felt stable begins to shift in ways that cannot be easily corrected. And Margaret had built her authority on consistency, on predictability, on the expectation that every interaction would follow a pattern she understood. And now that pattern was breaking, not dramatically, but enough to disrupt her sense of control, and I could see it most clearly. During the HOA meeting that took place the following Thursday evening, the same room, the same arrangement of chairs, the same carefully organized agenda printed on thick paper, but the atmosphere was different, quieter in a way that suggested uncertainty rather than routine. And Margaret stood at the front as she always did, composed, structured, moving through each item with practiced precision. But there were interruptions, small at first, questions that required clarification, references to notices that had not yet been resolved, and each time she responded, there was a fraction of a second where her confidence seemed to recalibrate, as if she were adjusting to information she had not anticipated, and most people in the room did not notice it, not consciously, but they felt it, the shift in tone, the slight disruption in the flow. And that is how control begins to erode, not through confrontation, but through inconsistency, through moments where the expected response does not arrive exactly as it should. And after the meeting ended, I saw her standing near the exit, speaking with someone from the administrative office, her voice lower than usual, her expression more focused, and I did not need to hear the conversation to understand its significance, because by then, the process had already reached a point where it could no longer be contained within the boundaries she had established, and the requests for review had expanded, the initial inquiry leading to additional questions, additional records being pulled, additional connections being examined. And systems like this do not reverse once they begin to move forward. They follow their own logic, their own structure, and that structure is designed to prioritize consistency over convenience, which means that any deviation, any inconsistency, becomes something that must be resolved. And Margaret's system, for all its precision, contained those inconsistencies, small gaps that had once gone unnoticed, but were now being examined with a level of scrutiny she had not accounted for. and I returned to the same position I had taken from the beginning, observing, allowing the process to unfold, because the most effective outcome is one that appears inevitable, one that emerges from the system itself rather than being forced upon it. And that inevitability was beginning to take shape, not visible to everyone, not yet, but present in the way the structure was shifting, in the way the foundation she had relied on was no longer stable. And as I stood there watching her leave the building, her steps measured, her expression controlled, I could tell she was beginning to understand that something had changed, even if she did not yet know what it was. The formal notice did not arrive with urgency or drama. It arrived the way all consequential things do inside a structured system, quietly, precisely, and without any indication of how much it would matter once it was opened. And Margaret Whitmore received it on a Tuesday morning just after 9, delivered through the same channels she had relied on for years, the same channels she believed she understood completely. And I was not there when she read it. But I did not need to be, because I have seen that moment before. The exact second when someone realizes that the system they trusted is no longer operating in their favor, and it always begins the same way, with a small shift in expectation, a line of text that does not align with what they anticipated, a request that cannot be dismissed or redirected. And from that point forward, everything changes, and the notice itself was straightforward, a request for full documentation related to a series of permits and inspection closures, a directive to provide clarification on administrative inconsistencies, and a scheduled hearing to address the findings. Nothing accusatory, nothing definitive, just the formal beginning of a process that would examine everything she had built. And processes like that do not rely on emotion or perception. They rely on structure, on evidence, on the same framework Margaret had used to establish her control, and that was the part she had not accounted for. That the system she shaped could also be used to evaluate her actions with the same precision she had once applied to others. And over the next several days, the changes became more visible, not to everyone, but to those paying attention. The administrative office that once responded immediately now required additional verification. The approvals that once moved without delay now paused for review, and Margaret's interactions shifted accordingly, still controlled, still measured, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency that had not been there before, and I could see it most clearly in the way she approached conversations. The increased attention to detail, the subtle attempts to reinforce her authority through familiarity, through routine, as if maintaining the appearance of control could restore it. And for most people, that would have been enough, because appearances often shape perception, and perception often shapes reality, but not in a system that has already begun to question its own consistency. And that was the stage we had reached, the point where the structure itself was no longer stable, where each new piece of information was evaluated not in isolation, but in relation to everything that came before it. And that is where patterns become undeniable, where inconsistencies accumulate into something that cannot be explained away as coincidence. And the hearing was scheduled for the following week, not immediately, because these processes require time, time to gather, time to verify, time to ensure that what is presented can withstand scrutiny. And that time can feel like control to someone who does not understand what is happening beneath the surface, because nothing appears to be final, nothing appears to be decided, and yet everything is already moving toward a conclusion that cannot be easily altered. And I returned to my routine during those days, not out of necessity, but out of discipline, because when you have done the work correctly, the outcome does not require constant attention. It requires patience, and patience has always been the difference between reaction and resolution. And as the morning of the hearing approached, the air carried that same quiet stillness I had felt on the night of the fire, not identical, but similar enough to register. A sense that something had reached a point where it could no longer remain unresolved. And I arrived early, as I always do, stepping into the familiar environment where structure replaces uncertainty, where every detail has its place, and every process follows a defined path. And I took my position without hesitation, not as someone affected by what had happened, but as someone responsible for ensuring that what comes next is handled with the clarity and precision it requires. And when the doors opened and Margaret Whitmore stepped inside, carrying the same composure she had maintained from the beginning, I could see in her expression that she still believed this was something she could manage, something she could navigate the way she always had. and for a moment, nothing in the room suggested otherwise. Because systems do not reveal their conclusions until the process demands it. The room did not change when Margaret Whitmore stepped inside, but the way she perceived it did, and that difference is where everything finally came into focus. Because from her perspective, this was still a situation she could navigate, still a structure she understood, and she carried herself accordingly, posture straight, expression composed, eyes scanning the room with the same quiet confidence she had displayed at every HOA meeting. Every conversation, every moment where she believed she was in control, and for a brief second, nothing challenged that belief. Nothing disrupted the image she had built for herself, and then the process began, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured precision that had guided everything leading up to this point. Documents presented, timelines established, questions asked in a way that required clarity rather than interpretation, and I watched as she adjusted. As she moved through each response with the same practiced tone, reinforcing her position, relying on the language she had used so many times before, and it worked at first. The surface held, the structure remained intact, because systems do not collapse all at once. They resist, they maintain their form until the pressure reaches a point where consistency can no longer be preserved, and that point arrived not through confrontation, but through alignment. Through the moment when each piece of evidence was placed within the same frame, the permits, the inspection closures, the communication logs, the timing, all presented not as isolated details, but as a sequence that could not be separated without losing coherence. And I could see the shift then, subtle but unmistakable, the exact second when her responses began to slow, when the certainty in her voice recalibrated into something more measured, more cautious, because the narrative she had relied on no longer fit the structure being presented. And that is where control begins to slip, not in the absence of answers, but in the presence of questions that cannot be answered within the framework someone has built for themselves. And the process continued, steady, deliberate, each step reinforcing the last, until the pattern that had once been hidden beneath layers of administrative complexity stood clearly within the room, not as accusation, but as fact. And facts do not require emphasis, they do not need to be raised or repeated, they simply exist. And when they align, they carry their own weight, and Margaret understood that. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough to register, the slight tightening of her expression, the careful recalibration of her responses, the recognition that the system she had relied on was now operating according to a structure she could no longer influence. And that is the moment everything changes, not when someone is told they are wrong, but when they realize that the outcome no longer depends on what they say. And as the final sequence was established, as the process reached its natural conclusion, there was no need for anything further, no escalation, no dramatics, just the application of the same principles that had governed every step along the way: clarity, consistency, and the understanding that once a structure reveals its own contradictions, the resolution follows inevitably. And Margaret Whitmore, for all her preparation, for all her control, had built something that could not withstand that level of scrutiny. And when the process concluded, the room returned to stillness, the same quiet precision that had defined it from the beginning. But the difference now was undeniable, not in the environment, but in the outcome that had been set in motion. And as she turned to leave, her steps measured, her expression composed, I knew that everything she had built would now be evaluated under the same system she once believed she controlled, and that was never a process anyone could simply walk away from.